There was a moment in my life when I stood in front of billion-dollar decisions without fear. But I was terrified of one simple conversation with the woman I loved. People think success removes fear. It doesn't. Sometimes the higher you rise, the heavier your secrets become. And tonight, I'm finally ready to tell the truth I've hidden for years. This is not about business, not about money, not about fame. This is about love. The kind of love that changes your future forever. What I'm about to reveal almost destroyed my marriage, my peace, and the person I had become. If you've ever loved someone deeply, if you've ever carried a secret so heavy it kept you awake at night, then stay with me until the very end. Because the final truth I shared with my wife changed everything between us forever. I built my life believing that logic could solve every problem. Numbers made sense. Machines made sense. The future made sense. But love was unpredictable. When I met her, she didn't care about my ambitions, my plans, or the world I wanted to create. She looked directly into my soul and saw the exhausted man hiding behind the dream. That terrified me more than failure ever could. Or the first time I met someone who could see beyond the image people admired. She saw my loneliness. She saw the sleepless nights. She saw the pressure I never admitted to anyone else. And somehow, instead of running away, she stayed. That was the moment I realized real love isn't about finding someone impressed by your success. It's about finding someone who still holds your hand when success stops feeling meaningful. As the years passed, my world became louder. Cameras followed me. Expectations grew. Every decision carried pressure. People believed I had everything under control. But behind closed doors, I was fighting battles no one could see. There were nights when I sat alone, wondering if I was losing myself while trying to build the future. And during all those moments, she remained the calm in my chaos. But the problem with carrying pressure for too long is that eventually you start hiding parts of yourself, even from the people you love most. I convinced myself I was protecting her by staying silent. I told myself she didn't need to know how broken I sometimes felt inside. But silence creates distance, and distance quietly destroys relationships. The more I hid why struggles, the more I felt like I was standing beside her physically, while emotionally drifting miles away. Then came the night everything changed. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked a question that shattered me completely. She said, "Why do I feel like I'm losing you, even when you're right here beside me?" That sentence hit harder than any criticism, failure, or public attack I had ever experienced. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I had become addicted to chasing the next mission, the next goal, the next impossible dream. I was giving the world my energy while giving the woman I loved only the leftovers of my heart. And in that moment, I realized something painful. Success means nothing if the person you love feels alone while standing next to you. That night, I finally told her the secret I had hidden for years. I told her I was scared. Scared that one day I would wake up and realize I had built incredible things while destroying the most important relationship in my life. I admitted that despite all my confidence in public, there were moments I felt empty inside. I confessed that sometimes I pushed people away because I feared becoming emotionally end on anyone. For the first time in years, I stopped pretending to be unstoppable. And instead of judging me, she cried and held my hand tighter. She told me something I will never forget. I never needed you to be perfect. I only needed you to be real. In that moment, I understood the greatest lesson of my life. Love doesn't grow through perfection. It grows through honesty. After that conversation, everything changed between us. Not because our problems disappeared, but because the walls between us finally collapsed. I started making time for the moments that truly mattered. Quiet dinners, late-night conversations, simple laughter without distractions. I learned that the future I was trying to build for humanity meant nothing if I ignored the human heart closest to mine. People often ask what the greatest achievement of my life is. They expect answers about technology, innovation, or changing the world. But the truth is far simpler. My greatest achievement was learning how to love someone without hiding behind ambition, ego, or fear. So tonight, if you're listening to this while carrying a secret in your heart, let me tell you something important. Don't wait until Selenke. E destroys the people you love. Don't assume strength means hiding your emotions. The strongest thing a person can do is tell the truth before it's too late. Because at the end of the day, the world will remember your success for a while. But the people you love will remember how you made them feel forever. And if you are lucky enough to have someone who stays beside you during your darkest moments, protect that love with everything you have. Because real love is rarer than genius, rarer than fame, and more valuable than anything money can buy. There was a moment in my life when everything I had built looked perfect from the outside. Yet inside, I felt something quietly breaking that I could not explain to anyone. People saw success, progress, innovation, and control. But they never saw the nights where I sat alone staring at a future that suddenly felt heavier than I ever imagined. I used to believe that if you work hard enough, think long enough, and push far enough, everything becomes stable, predictable, and manageable. But life doesn't work like that when emotions enter the equation, especially not love. Love changes the structure of everything you thought you understood. I remember the first time I realized that even the strongest mind can feel powerless in front of one honest relationship. It didn't come as a dramatic event. It came quietly, in the form of silence between conversations, in the way someone you care about starts noticing what you're not saying more than what you are saying. That silence was louder than any public attention I had ever experienced. It followed me into rooms, into meetings, into achievements that were supposed to feel like victory. But instead of celebration, I felt distance growing between me and the one person I never wanted to lose. The strange thing about building a life under pressure is that you slowly start believing you must hide your vulnerability to protect others. I told myself that sharing less would mean worrying less. I told myself that being strong meant carrying everything alone. But I didn't realize that silence is not protection, it is separation. Every unspoken thought created a wall I didn't see forming. And the more I focused on external goals, the more I felt an internal gap widening, something I could not measure, something no achievement could fill. Then came the moments I could no longer ignore. The smallest questions started carrying the heaviest weight. A simple look would feel like a question I had no answer for. And deep inside, I knew I was standing at a point where continuing this silence would cost me something far greater than success. I was not afraid of failure in the world. I was afraid of failing the person who had seen me beyond everything I pretended to be. That fear doesn't shout, it whispers. It stays with you when everything else becomes quiet. I began to realize that the life I had built required not just intelligence or ambition, but honesty. Not just strategy, but emotional truth. And the hardest truth was that I had been trying to protect love by hiding from it. But love doesn't survive in distance. It survives in presence, in vulnerability, in moments where you stop trying to be unshakable and instead become real enough to be understood. That realization didn't come as a solution. It came as a confrontation with everything I had avoided saying out loud for a long time. I built my life believing that control was the highest form of strength. If I could control my thoughts, my time, my emotions, and my decisions, then nothing could truly be BR or eke me. That was the mindset I carried into every challenge, every project, and every relationship. It worked in machines, it worked in systems, and it worked in the world of logic. But I slowly discovered that human connection does not obey the same rules. Love cannot be engineered, optimized, or predicted like a formula. It reacts to presence, honesty, and emotional truth in ways that cannot be calculated. When I met her, I didn't immediately understand what was happening to me. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was subtle, like a shift in gravity I couldn't measure but could definitely feel. She didn't respond to my achievements the way others did. She didn't look at success as something that defined me. Instead, she looked at who I was when I was not performing, not speaking, not building anything. That unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain at the time. Because I had spent years constructing an identity that was admired from a distance, but she was interested in the person behind that structure. At first, I tried to maintain balance between my internal world and my external responsibilities. I told myself I could compartmentalize everything. Work here, emotions love in a separate space that would never interfere with ambition. But that separation was an illusion. The more I tried to divide my life into sections, the more I felt like I was disappearing from the inside. I was physically present everywhere, but emotionally present nowhere. And the person who noticed it first was her. She didn't accuse me. She didn't confront me in anger. She simply started asking quieter questions. Questions that didn't demand answers, but revealed truths I was avoiding. And that was more powerful than any argument, because I realized I couldn't hide behind busyness forever. There comes a point where silence itself becomes an answer. And the silence between us started saying things I was not ready to admit. I began to understand that love was not just about being together in moments of success, but being emotionally available in moments of uncertainty. Yet I was conditioned to believe that uncertainty was something to eliminate, not share. So instead of opening up, I withdrew further into my own internal systems. I convinced myself I was protecting her from stress, when in reality, I was protecting myself from vulnerability. And in doing so, I intent on creating the very distance I feared the most. One evening, I noticed something I could no longer ignore. The connection that once felt effortless now required effort just to maintain basic understanding. And that realization hit harder than any professional setback I had ever experienced. Because I could rebuild companies. I could solve technical problems. I could handle failure in the outside world. But I didn't know how to rebuild emotional distance once it had formed between two hearts that once felt aligned. And in that moment, I understood that control was never strength in love. It was the very thing slowly taking love away from me without me even realizing it. Ending sentence. As time passed, I started noticing that the life I carefully structured was slowly becoming emotionally unbalanced. Even though, on the surface, everything looked stable and successful. I was still moving forward in my work, still solving problems that others thought were impossible, still building things that people admired. But internally, something was changing in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The conversations at home became shorter, the silences became longer, and what once fell to like natural connection started feeling like two people living parallel lives under the same roof. At first, I tried to convince myself it was temporary. I told myself that pressure does this to everyone, that phases like this come and go, and that eventually everything would naturally realign. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding the truth. Because real connection doesn't just drift apart without reason. It fades when it is not nurtured. And I had been so focused on external responsibilities that I didn't realize I was unintentionally neglecting the most important internal responsibility of all: emotional presence. I remember moments when she would look at me, not with anger, but with quiet confusion, as if she was trying to understand someone she once knew deeply, but now felt slightly distant from. That kind of silence is heavier than any argument, because arguments at least show engagement. Silence shows emotional withdrawal, and I could feel that space growing between us, even when nothing was being said out loud. The hardest part was realizing that I was physically present, but emotionally absent. I was sitting beside her, sharing the same space, but not fully sharing me. Yourself. My mind was always elsewhere. Planning, thinking, calculating, preparing for the next challenge. And in doing so, I forgot that love does not live in future plans or past achievements. It lives in the present moment, in attention, in listening, in being fully there without distraction. There were nights when I would sit alone after long days and replay conversations in my mind, trying to understand where things started shifting. And slowly, it became clear that the shift didn't happen in one moment. It happened in thousands of small moments I didn't value at the time. A missed conversation here, a distracted response there, a delayed emotional reaction when it mattered most. None of them felt significant individually, but together they formed a distance that became difficult to ignore. I also realized something uncomfortable about myself during that time. I had trained myself to handle complexity everywhere, except where it mattered most emotionally. I could solve external problems quickly, but I struggled with internal honesty. I could face global challenges, but I avoided difficult personal conversations. And that imbalance was slowly affecting the one relationship I cared about more than anything else. Eventually, I reached a point where I understood that ignoring the distance would not make it disappear. Time does not heal emotional neglect on its own. It either deepens connection or deepens separation, depending on what you do with it. And I could feel that if I didn't change something within myself, I might lose something that no success in the world could ever replace. Ending sentence. There came a point where I could no longer pretend that everything was fine, because pretending it started costing me more than honesty ever could. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a strange heaviness in my chest, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything I had left unsaid. It is a strange kind of suffering when your external world is celebrated, yet your internal world feels like it is quietly collapsing. I had experienced pressure before, but this was different. This was not pressure from the world. This was pressure from my own silence. Every interaction started feeling like it had two layers. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Conversations, routines, shared space. But underneath, there was an unspoken tension that neither of us fully addressed. I could sense she was holding back questions, and I was holding back answers. And that mutual restraint slowly turned into emotional distance. Not because we stopped caring, but because we stopped expressing what we felt in its purest form. And when love stops being expressed, it starts becoming assumption instead of connection. I tried to distract myself by focusing even more on work, convincing myself that if I just pushed harder externally, internally, things would somehow stabilize on their own. But that strategy only made things worse. Because the more I escaped into responsibilities, the more I realized I was running away from the one conversation I needed to have the most. And deep down, I knew that no amount of achievement could fix what silence was slowly breaking. There was one particular evening that changed everything inside me. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. We were sitting together, and I could feel a distance that words had created over time, without either of us fully acknowledging it. She looked at me differently that day, not with anger, but with exhaustion. And in that moment, I understood something painful. Sometimes love doesn't leave suddenly. It just becomes tired of waiting for honesty that never arrives. That night, I could not sleep. I kept replaying every moment where I chose silence over truth, thinking I was being strong, when in reality, I was just avoiding discomfort. And for the first time, I stopped analyzing outcomes and started confronting emotions. I realized that if I continued this path, I might achieve everything externally and still lose the one person who understood me beyond all of it. That realization broke something in me, but it also awakened something I had been suppressing for too long. So I made a decision that terrified me more than any professional risk I had ever taken. I decided that I would no longer hide behind controlled conversations or partial truths. I would tell her everything I had been carrying inside, the fear, the distance, the emotional exhaustion, and the truth about how disconnected I had become from myself while trying to manage everything else. Not because I knew it would fix everything immediately, but because I finally understood that honesty was not the end of stability, it was the beginning of real connection. And as I armed myself for that moment, I realized that the hardest battles are not fought in public or in systems, but in the quiet decision to be emotionally seen by the person who matters the most. Ending sentence. The moment I finally decided to speak honestly, I realized that courage in personal life feels completely different from courage in professional life. In the outside world, risks are calculated, measured, and often supported by data or strategy. But in matters of the heart, there is no formula that guarantees safety. You are not presenting an idea, you are revealing yourself. And that is far more vulnerable than any decision I had ever made before. I remember sitting there, aware that what I was about to say could change everything between us. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a deeply human way, where understanding could either be rebuilt or broken further. For a long time, I had believed that protecting someone meant hiding the parts of myself that felt uncertain or weak. But I had slowly learned that people do not feel protected by silence, they feel excluded by it. And exclusion, even when unintentional, creates distance that time alone cannot fix. When I finally started speaking, it wasn't structured or rehearsed. It came out in fragments, like thoughts I had been holding inside for too long, finally finding air. I talked about the pressure I had been carrying, not just from the world, but from within myself. I admitted that I had been trying to appear emotionally strong by avoiding emotional honesty. And in doing so, I had unintentionally created a version of myself that looked stable on the outside, but was disconnected on the inside. As I spoke, I could see her reaction shifting, not into judgment, but into realization. And that realization carried its own emotional weight. Because sometimes the hardest thing for someone to hear is not that you are struggling, but that you have been struggling alone while sitting right beside them. That kind of emotional distance hurts in a way that is difficult to describe. It doesn't come from betrayal. It comes from silence that lasted too long. There was a moment during that conversation where I paused, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I finally understood something important. I had spent so much time trying to manage perception that I had neglected connection. I was so focused on being understood by the world that I stopped making sure I was understood at home. And that imbalance had quietly affected everything I thought was stable. But what surprised me most was not the fear I felt. It was the relief that followed honesty. It wasn't immediate healing, and it didn't magically erase the distance between us, but it created something that had been missing for a long time. Truth in the space between us. And truth, even when difficult, has the power to rebuild foundations that silence slowly weakens. That night didn't solve everything, but it changed the direction of everything. Because once honesty enters a relationship, even after distance, it creates the possibility of rebuilding instead of drifting further apart. And I realized that love does not survive perfection. It survives truth, especially when that truth is difficult to say, but necessary to hear ending sentence. After that conversation, something subtle but deeply important began to change between us. It wasn't an instant transformation, and it didn't erase all the distance that had built up over time, but it created something I had almost forgotten existed between two people who truly care for each other. Understanding. And understanding is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly in the space where honesty finally replaces silence. In the days that followed, I started noticing the difference in small moments rather than big gestures. Conversations became less guarded. There was less hesitation in words, less emotional filtering, less fear of being misunderstood. I realized that when two people stop protecting illusions and start sharing reality, even difficult reality, the connection becomes more grounded. It may not always feel comfortable, but it feels real, and real is what had been missing. I also began to reflect on how easily I had mistaken emotional distance for strength. For a long time, I believed that being strong meant carrying everything internally without showing vulnerability. But I slowly understood that emotional isolation is not strength. It is separation. True strength is not in hiding what you feel, but in being able to express it without fear of losing respect or love. That shift in perspective changed how I approached not just my relationship, but how I understood myself. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when old habits tried to return, where silence felt easier than explanation. But I started catching myself earlier. Instead of withdrawing, I would pause and choose to speak. Instead of assuming understanding, I would choose clarity. These choices seemed small individually, but together they started rebuilding trust that had quietly weakened over time. What struck me most was how much emotional honesty can reshape perception. The same person who once felt distant began to feel closer again, not because circumstances changed dramatically, but because communication did. I realized that love does not always need grand solutions. It needs consistent truth, not perfect truth, not polished truth, honest truth, shared in time. And in that process, I understood something that stayed with me deeply. The most important relationships in life are not maintained by avoiding conflict or hiding imperfections. They are maintained by the willingness to stay present even when conversations are uncomfortable, because avoidance creates distance. But honesty, even when difficult, creates connection. Looking back, I don't see that phase as a failure anymore. I see it as a correction, a moment where I was forced to recognize that success in one part of life cannot compensate for emotional absence in another. And more importantly, I learned that love is not something you protect by staying silent. It is something you protect by staying real. In the end, what I gained was not just clarity in my relationship, but clarity within myself. I understood that no achievement, no ambition, and no vision for the future means anything if you lose the ability to be fully present with the person who matters most in your present ending sentence. In the end, what I came to understand is that life is not truly measured by how much we build, how far we go, or how many people recognize our success. Those things matter, but they are not the deepest measure of a life well lived. The real measure is much quieter and far more personal. It is found in the relationships we protect, the honesty we are willing to speak, and the moments where we choose truth over comfort, even when it is difficult. I once believed that strength meant having answers for everything, staying composed no matter what.